All right, breaking overnight, everyone, the city of Baltimore removing 4 Confederate statues after the city voted unanimously to have them removed. And news today, white nationalists are planning a rally in Lexington, Kentucky to oppose the city's plan to take down 2 Confederate statues there. The same group was in Charlottesville over the weekend protesting the planned removal of a Robert E. Lee statue. President Trump had this to say about the statues.
Many of those people were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. So, this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
It's kind of a non sequitur, really. I mean, to be comparing a Civil War hero to the first president of the United States or to Thomas Jefferson. I mean, clearly Thomas Jefferson and George Washington represent something very different about America. General Lee, on the other hand, represents something that was very much a dark time in American history and something that we're still, to this day, dealing with the aftermath of. So why glorify it? Ron Christie and Harlan Hill are back with me. First to you. Ron, I mean, why not take all these statues? I get, okay, they're part of our history, and you can't erase history, but do you really want to flaunt that history? I mean, you know, you're an African-American, I'm not, but I got to tell you, when I see statues like that, it makes me uncomfortable. I would have to think it would make you uncomfortable.
Well, good to see you again, Trish. I'm not thrilled with these statues. I think they represent a dark time in America, the dark stain of slavery. On the other hand, as a student of history, I do understand the importance of not turning our backs on our history. The one problem I have is the moral equivalence the president seemed to draw yesterday between the statue of General Lee and then talking about our first president, George Washington, the great founding father of our country. We can have a good debate about whether Confederate statues should remain in place, but I just don't think this is an area where the president should be wading into. No,
and it didn't make any sense. I mean, Harlan, he was doing fine when he said, look, I'll leave it up to municipalities, to local governments. When you have these statues on federal land, then we'll make a decision about them at the federal level. But I'll let you all basically to make your own decision on that. And then he took it that step further. And then he asked, well, does that mean you're going to take down George Washington? Because George Washington was a slave owner. George Washington represents a very different thing in American history. The Civil War is not a time that we want to relive.
Well, and to his point, I think that it's a valid question to raise. Do we want to relive a period of time when certain people in our society were owned by other humans? And, you know, that is the logical extension of this line of thought if we're going to start pulling down statues. Now, let me preface all of this.
Can I jump in real quick?
Okay.
I want to point something out to the viewer. You know, a lot of these statues actually came about during the Jim Crow era. Okay,
yes,
so right. You know, there was a reason, shall we say, why they were putting these statues up. Guess when they also came about? 85 of these 700 and some odd statues that exist in the United States, they came into being during the 50s and 60s during all the civil rights demonstrations. So you've got to wonder about the timing of this. In other words, why were these statues erected at these particular times in history, Harlan?
Right. I mean, and look, the president was very measured in his response to this. As you laid out, he said that he wanted to leave this to states and cities. And ultimately, that's what we're going to do. There's not going to be some edict from the federal government saying that you can't remove these statues. And so that's really the end of the discussion.
Further. I mean, the equating Robert Lee with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, Ron, you're shaking your head. That's when it started to really go south.
That's crazy, Trish. And let me say this. Let me add one thing further. You know, as a direct descendant of slaves in my hometown here in Virginia, there's a statue that I pass going home and going to work every day of a Civil War soldier. Why is it there? It's there. It was erected during times of Jim Crow. It was erected, I think, as a form of intimidation to people of color. And it's almost their way of giving the finger to people of color, saying, you better keep in line.
That's why I don't like it. You know what? The North won.
Yeah, the war of northern aggression? No, I don't think so.
The North won. And you know what? There's no place for that intimidation or this glorification of what slavery represented, Ron.
But the president's not calling for that. He's not calling for the glorification of these. I mean, he has been unequivocal in his condemnation of the violence in Charlottesville.
There are people calling for that, Harlan. That's why have the statues in the first place, all right? Look, I'm from the North. I'm not from the South, so I don't have necessarily the same appreciation for that whole Confederacy. But I look at it and say, why is it there? Because I do think it's intimidating.
Look, it is a very direct affront to people like me and my family who not only are direct descendants of slaves, but had to grow up in the Jim Crow South, where my parents and my grandparents were called the N-word, where crosses were burned, where my relatives who marched and fought for civil rights. I think it's very disgusting for them at this juncture in the 21st century to have to look at some of these statues and the terrible memories that it brings up of pain, intimidation, and threats that they all endured directly.
You know, get rid of them. Put them all in a museum somewhere. And you can make your annual pilgrimage once a year and celebrate what was if you're so inclined. But the rest of us don't have to look at it.
No.
Ron and Harlan, thank you so much. Good to see you guys.